Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everybody, and welcome to Pangolin, the Conservation Podcast. The podcast dedicated to telling fascinating, fantastic, interesting, underexplored, and amazing conservation stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. I am your host, Jack Baker, and on this week's show, I am joined by Tilen Genov of Morigenos, the Slovenian Marine Mammal Conservation Organization. Today, we're going to be talking all about cetaceans, whales, and dolphins all over the world, but specifically within the kind of remit of this organization, which is around Slovenia. Um, Now, the reason we're talking about this, I think a lot of you might think, oh, dolphins, really popular animals. Why are you covering this on a show that's supposed to be about animals that not a lot of people know about? Well, not only is this kind of population being studied for the first time and exclusively by this organization and by Tilen, it's also something that I've really wanted to talk about, not only because I have a love of the sea, but also because I feel like a lot of the conversation around whales and dolphins focuses on them being kept in captivity. Of course, you have the scandals of Blackfish, perhaps most infamously, but then also things like recent calls for tour providers and holiday operators to pull out of selling tickets to SeaWorld as part of their package deals and stuff. So, kind of focused conversation there. And I really want to, while that is all very important, I want to focus on today's episode on dolphins out in the wild and the threats that they face out there. And that's really it leads to some really interesting discussion. We talk a lot about the kind of pollution aspect that affects them. So not just in the kind of physical things that we imagine when we talk about pollution, like the plastics, also the chemicals that are released into the ocean as well. We kind of cover that aspect, which I think is really interesting. We also talk about dolphin behavior and identifying dolphins and all sorts of other topics that I hope you will find, yeah, extremely, extremely, extremely interesting. So I will be quiet now for a second because I think Tilan is the best person to talk about this. So I will leave it here for just now and I'll be back at the end to sign off once you've had a listen to this interview. I really hope you enjoy. And as always, link to everything we discuss can be found in the episode description. So if there's anything while we're going through that you want to look at or want more information on, if you go to the description, you'll be able to find all of that there as well. So I hope you enjoy, and yes, I will. I'll talk to you again very, very soon. So, welcome back to the show. I am now joined by Tilen Genov, the founder and president of Morigenos, the Slovenian Marine Mammal Society, who is also a member of the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group. So, he is here to talk about his work and, more specifically, his recent work with dolphins. So, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I thought just to get started, always like to ask people to just kind of introduce themselves to listeners and let them know a little bit about your background and yeah, where you are now.
So I consider myself a marine conservation biologist. I mainly focus on marine mammals, specifically whales and dolphins in particular. And in my work, I combine scientific research. So I am a field biologist. I spend a lot of time in the field and doing research. But I also focus a lot of my time on things like education and public awareness, and also working with different stakeholders, including fishermen and government and so on, to kind of promote and hopefully improve conservation of the marine ecosystems. So this would be kind of me in a nutshell.
Yes, and it's really interesting and kind of so many things there that we'll come to throughout the interview, and I'll ask you about your work in different elements. But one thing I actually noticed today when I was doing my last little bit of research about you is you went to St Andrews, which is where I did my master's. So it's kind of, I wanted to ask what you worked, presumably, what was your master's in? What was it you kind of did there?
So I went there to do the Emirates course in marine mammal science, because as you might know, St Andrews actually has one of the largest, if not the largest, marine mammal unit in the world. So I went there to kind of, broaden my horizons, get certain additional skills in marine mammal science. And I actually happened to work for my thesis on something completely, quite unrelated to what I do normally here. I'm based in Slovenia, and most of my work actually revolves around Adriatic Sea and Mediterranean Sea. But for my master's, I did spatial distribution modeling of three small cetacean species in Chile, so Chilean dolphins, Peale's dolphins, and Burmeister's porpoises, because I wanted to kind of broaden my horizons kind of to a non-Mediterranean species and something I haven't worked with before. And at the moment, I'm actually in my last stretches of my PhD also at St. Andrews, although I'm not currently physically there. But yeah, so St. Andrews is kind of a very important place for me generally.
It's the new marine science building was lucky to get into it before it all had to kind of close this year. So it's a fantastic facility, and we had a lot of lectures and did a lot of work there. So when I saw that pop up this morning, I thought I had to ask.
I actually have yet to see it. I haven't been there since the new building opened. So I was supposed to go there last year, but then, the pandemic happened. And so still need to go there and see it.
It's worth look forward to it one day. It's a good thing to have as your light at the end of the tunnel is you'll get to go and see it because it's a fantastic building. I really liked it, but the lecture halls I think were really good, but they were poorly designed in a way because you have this beautiful glass wall behind the lecturers, and so you're sitting there looking out at the ocean and all this beautiful scenery, and you're trying to focus on what they're saying, but you're also looking out. It's a fantastic building, but yeah, be aware if you're talking to an audience, you really have to grasp their attention. Right. So yes, but that's interesting that you mentioned kind of working with the Chilean species. Was it always your interest was this particular kind of group of animals, the dolphins, whales, or was that something you only found when you got to university and started studying these things more deeply? When did this kind of interest start?
Yeah, it's for me, it started already at a very early age, back when I was a kid in primary school, basically. I was also always kind of interested into nature and animals and being interested in different aspects of nature and different animal groups and so on. I even had, periods as a kid of being more into snakes or being more into large cats and etc. But I kept kind of coming back to cetaceans, to whales and dolphins regularly. And then as a kid, I was lucky because I was exposed to a Italian group working in one of the islands, one of the Croatian islands in the Adriatic, because my relatives happened to live on that same island. So already as a kid, I kind of got interested in what they were doing and visiting them, asking loads of questions, too much questions if you ask them, probably. And so that kind of, transformed into something more serious, into this becoming something that I really knew from a very early age that I wanted to do. So even before actually starting university studies, I was already fairly active in field research, and the studies basically just made kind of a formal baseline for me to continue and pursue this direction.
Interesting. And then obviously you've gotten very into it now by kind of founding this organization and all that sort of thing. So they can't complain about you asking all of the questions because it led to where you are now. If you if you just kind of been annoying it with them and then done nothing with it, then not they could complain. But now, no excuse to be moaning about that. Um, and I thought before we kind of got into your recent work, it would be worthwhile for the listeners just kind of um, obviously I think a lot of the conversation that focuses around cetaceans now is specifically regarding kind of them in aquariums and then whether they should be kept in them, if that kind of debate going on. And I wondered though if you could kind of tell us about. Obviously, you work with wild animals, so I was wondering if you could kind of sum up for the listeners who might not know what the major threats are to cetaceans out in the wild.
So the threats, generally speaking, threats are quite numerous and quite varied. and this will also depend highly on the species and even the location you're talking about. So it might not be the same for all whale and dolphin species. For some, ship strikes might be a bigger problem, such as some of the large whales like fin whales or sperm whales. The primary threat to them is actually ship strikes from large, fast-moving cargo ships or fast ferries, etc. But then for other species, underwater noise might be a bigger issue. But for marine mammals generally and globally, the primary threat worldwide is getting caught in fishing nets, getting caught as bycatch in fishing nets, so not being the primary target, but incidentally getting entangled and then dying in these fishing nets. And again, this will vary by location and by species. Some species will be more vulnerable to this than others, and even there might be differences among different populations of the same species. But generally speaking and globally, bycatch in fishing gear is the primary threat to survival of cetaceans, and a number of species are currently at the brink of extinction because of it. Sorry, just to add, there's then also other issues such as, plastic pollution, which is quite a hot topic nowadays. Chemical pollution is also another issue, which is kind of a silent and invisible threat to these animals. So in some cases, it's one threat, in some cases, it's the other. And in many cases, it's actually the combination of all these threats combined, And just to note, many people think that, for example, whaling is a conservation issue, but in reality, whaling might be more of a welfare issue if we are concerned about, the suffering and dying of animals, which we kind of think of as being quite highly intelligent. But in terms of conservation, whaling used to be a threat in the past, and we actually did bring some of the species really to the brink of extinction. But today, whaling does not really play a direct threat to the survival of species at the moment. Most other things that we as humans do is playing a much bigger role.
That's interesting. I think that's a really interesting kind of distinction to make as well, because it's often you find that people are very quick to point the finger at communities that maybe because of cultural practices or kind of certain things do take part in whaling. But then if they were to actually look at themselves in the mirror, you can think actually all of the other issues that are affecting them probably more, you can have an impact on. So instead of complaining about other people's actions, feel free to voice your opinion on them, but also look at what you're doing and affect them, affect your kind of your the way that you act. So yeah, that's a really interesting, I think, important distinction that you made, and I think it's something that struck me that you were talking about previously is the kind of bycatch from fisheries and things. And what I found fascinating is last year looking into kind of river dolphins. You'd expect them to face a whole series of other threats, but it's similar things when you kind of go from all over the world, you jump around these species. And I wrote a couple essays over the last year about river dolphins, and then kind of tracking dolphins out in the wild using kind of aerial methods and things, and always you seem to these same themes would spring up. So that was a really good kind of summary, I think. So thank you very much for giving it. And something else you brought up, of course, was the pollutants, which was something that you're looking into with your current work. And I wanted to ask kind of what are the major effects of pollutants on these species? I guess if we start, you said there was both the kind of chemical side and then also the physical items. What are the kind of impacts of the physical on cetacean species that you work with?
So the physical pollution typically, I mean, for the most part, relates to plastic pollution. Not only, but for the large majority, it's the plastics which is the problem, because it's not easily degradable. It's very present in our cultures and societies because we tend to use it a lot. And the main problem is because a lot of the plastic we use is disposable. It's not the long-lasting plastic, which is less of a problem. It's this plastic that we use once, a plastic cup, and then we throw it away. And again, plastic pollution, even though it's a hot topic, it's not, in my view, it's not necessarily the main or the biggest problem. but it is a problem. It doesn't mean we should, diminish it or ignore it. But again, when it comes to whales and dolphins, again, it can vary drastically among species. For some species, such as the bottlenose dolphins, for example, which is kind of your most typical flipper dolphin uh, present in most parts of the world, including the Mediterranean, and I focus most of my work on bottlenose dolphins. They seem to be fairly resilient to the effects of plastic pollution because we fairly rarely find pieces of plastics in their stomachs or in their digestive tracts. They seem to be fairly good at avoiding either ingesting it or getting entangled in it, although there are also exceptions. But then for some other species, such as some of the deep diving whales, like sperm whales or various beaked whales or even rhesus dolphins, they seem to be much more impacted by plastic, presumably because of the way they feed, the mechanisms of their feeding, which tends to happen in very deep water, often probably at the sea bottom. And a lot of this plastic debris ends up being at the sea bottom. And even though the exact mechanisms are not well understood yet, it seems that these species are more impacted by plastic pollution. So, it's very difficult to generalize, and it's also very difficult to assess the population level impacts of plastic, because you might find a young sperm whale stranded on a beach with a full stomach of plastic debris in it, but it's very hard to know if the death was caused by this whale eating this plastic, or if something else was already wrong with the individual that and then led to it trying to find alternative food, which ended up being plastic. For example, the animal might have been hit by a ship and unable to feed normally, which might have led to it ingesting more plastic, or it may have been compromised in its health, and that might have led to some abnormal feeding behavior. So it's very hard to tease apart these single cases and then generalize them to the entire population. And this is still kind of a topic of active research among many scientists, but it just goes to show that not all plastics is necessarily the same amount of problem for all species.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think about the kind of compounding of these things, that it's not, you can't boil it down to this one issue entirely. You've got to see where the intersections kind of meet, and where various things, a whole bunch of things that become very, very complicated and very, 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 very quickly. It's not like, oh, we can the headaches that you must have sometimes if you're given a sample or a case that says this animal has died, and please explain to us why, must not be a particularly easy process. How do you even start out of it? Like, how do you even start if someone was to come to you? Do you just have to break down and try and identify every factor that might have affected it and work back from there, or how does that work?
I think this is where good science comes into play, and trying to go and follow what the data are telling us, and trying to find caveats and holes and gaps in those data before jumping to conclusions, because it's very easy to jump into conclusions. I mean, I think humans we are all prone to that. We are all easy to make a conclusion based on insufficient evidence. And I actually have an anecdote related to that. We had a case where we saw a dolphin, one of our known dolphins, with a big plastic bag kind of wrapped over its dorsal fin on the back. And of course, the first reaction that anybody would get is like, "Oh, poor dolphin wrapped in plastic. That's horrible. The animal is suffering, and not and whatnot." But actually, that animal seemed to have some sort of a thing for plastic bags, because as we were observing it, the bag slid off the animal, and the dolphin turned around, came back to it, and picked it up again, actually, and continued swimming with it for a while. Then it kind of slid off again. The dolphin turned around again, picked it up again, and this was happening for a while. So, this particular individual had apparently some sort of a thing for carrying a plastic bag on its back. Of course, we don't know what the reason was. Maybe it liked the feeling. Maybe it was fun. Maybe he had an itch that had to be scratched somehow. Uh, we sometimes joke that maybe this was just a fashion accessory. We really don't know. And of course, this doesn't mean that, people should go out and throw plastic bags in the ocean so that dolphins can play with them. Obviously not. But it just goes to show that things are not always as they might seem in the first instance, and that we should, kind of take a step back and try to, as objectively as we can, assess the evidence. So coming back to your question, it's a difficult one, and just collecting more and more information from different animals and different sample sizes then gives us kind of a wider picture. Unfortunately, each individual animal can be informative, but on its own, we cannot draw any conclusions from a single finding or a single stranded animals. They're all informative, and this is why collecting this information is very important, and why publishing this information is important, and why stranding networks actually in different parts of the world have a huge value to them, because over the long term we can then look at some patterns and learn new things, which might then help improve the conservation for these animals in the future.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's interesting to hear about the kind of the fact that you need to do these studies all over the world. It's yes, I was speaking on last week's show to somebody from the Marine Conservation Society, and we were talking about how their citizen science project, you can look at what's on one beach, and that's kind of interesting, but it's more interesting to see the comparison and the picture you get if you do 100 beaches around the coast of the UK or across the world, and then you get to see this kind of wider picture. So it's interesting that you bring up that kind of need to share it and kind of go further than just studying in one place at one time. This is what's going on.
Exactly.
And I guess we touched on what may be the kind of obvious issue to look at in that there's the plastic floating around, but the other pollution issue is of course the things you can't see. And I wondered if you could explain, and it's probably very, very complicated, but for listeners, if they were kind of wondering, well, how did kind of these chemical pollutants, what's the story with that? How does it get into the water, and then how does it affect the animals that are interacting with it?
So there's a number of chemical compounds that some are natural and some are man-made by humans. And I guess the very quite important two examples are so-called PCBs and DDTs. They are man-made substances, and I'll focus more on the PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls. They are man-made substances that were used for a number of things, including sealants, electronics, paints, a number of different applications in both technology and infrastructure that we humans used. And especially in the 60s, they were widely used for a number of things, and they were kind of, super useful for a number of aspects. But then it turned out that they were actually super toxic and dangerous, not only to human health, but also to the environmental health. And it turned out that there were some of them were actually cancerogenic, so they can actually cause cancer. And most of them were immunosuppressants, which means they mess up your immune system to the point where it is no longer able to fend off general normal pathogens that it would usually be able to fend off. And therefore, you or an animal might get more susceptible to certain normal diseases that you would be able to kind of resist otherwise. But now, because your immune system is compromised, you're not able to do that, and you kind of succumb to the effects of the disease more easily. Then these compounds are also hormonal disruptors, which means they mess up the hormonal balance in our bodies. And they also impair reproduction. So they might actually slow down or completely suppress reproduction through a number of mechanisms. So bottom line, people realized that they were super dangerous, not only to human health, but also to the environment. And they were banned back in the 70s and 80s throughout most of the developed world. But the problem with these compounds is that they are still kind of present in some of the old infrastructure or landfills, or even captured in the marine sediments And then when we dredge certain ports or maritime pathways, we kind of resuspend them back into the water column. So now they become available to the marine food web again. And the other problem is that they are super persistent. They are very hard to degrade. They don't degrade easily, which means they are still circling the marine environments even decades after they were already banned. And we actually see this in dolphins that their PCB levels are still quite high, and they actually these levels actually exceed the thresholds for which we know, based on a number of studies worldwide, that they actually start to have physiological effects on the animals. And many animals actually exceed these thresholds. And one of the problems with these PCBs is that they are stored in fat tissue. And in case of dolphins and whales, the most of the fat is found under the skin in the so-called blubber, which is their insulation basically. And what happens is when a female is pregnant, and especially when she gives birth, a lot of these fats are mobilized from blubber into milk, because whales and dolphins are mammals just like we are. And this means that the young suckle mother's milk. And when that happens, a lot of those PCBs are actually literally washed off from mother to the offspring. And in some cases, the calf might actually get a lethal dose of those PCBs and die because of them. What happens to the female is that she gets kind of partially cleaned off by these things because she dumps her load onto the calf. And that's why in some populations we also see higher levels of firstborn calf mortality. So the first calf will often get this major dose of these pollutants and might not survive because of it. And then subsequent calves might actually do better because they get lower levels. And in case of females, if a female gives birth, she will kind of drop. She will be accumulating these compounds over her lifetime, but when she has her first calf, she will offload a lot of that, and then she will be kind of probably oscillating at some mean value. But males don't have that mechanism. Males just keep compiling them more and more and more, accumulating them. And this is why, based on laboratory studies with mink and rats and so on, we see this effect actually, the difference between males and females. And we also expect it based on what we know about mammalian physiology. And interestingly, we also see that in our dolphins, for example. Here in the Northern Adriatic, we did a study where we actually compared males and females, and males had drastically higher levels than females. And then when we further compared females among those that already had calves to those that never had a calf yet, again, it was a drastic difference, which kind of supports this notion of this so-called maternal offloading. And this is quite interesting. I mean, it's expected, like I said, but it's not very often that we actually get to show this in free-ranging cetaceans. There are a couple of studies in the world that were able to show this. And so this is kind of a general story with these PCBs, and shows that they're still present in our environments, even though they were banned decades ago.
Mm-hmm. It's a very sad story, obviously, because it is kind of affects these animals so much, and it will kind of the optimal solution is clearly not having a calf die every time. That is what is the kind of through your work you've kind of seen this proved in your kind of area, but what is your recommendation? What is your then recommendation, or is there any solution to this apart from just until it all has been absorbed and passed through? Like, how do you fix an issue like that?
So there's a number of things to consider here. There is this thing called the Stockholm Convention, which actually tackles this issue specifically. And there's a number of provisions or recommendations that member states, that different countries can do to tackle this pollution. I'm not an expert in the particular field of remediation and how you actually remove these compounds from the environment. But there are actually ways where you can prevent either leakage from landfills or old infrastructure. You can prevent or limit or at least modify the way you dredge ports or channels and so on to prevent the spreading of these compounds into the wider environment. There are even methods where you actually kind of actively clean out the sediment of these things, which I don't know the details of, but there are ways that this can be done. And actually, the United States have been quite successful in this in some places, because US generally had a bigger problem with PCB pollution than Europe has, but they were also more aggressive in tackling it afterwards. So Europe has been more passive in this front, which might be why we still see quite high levels in some places. So yeah, generally speaking, there are ways that pollution can be reduced, or at least to prevent new amounts of PCBs and other pollutants to get to be discharged into the marine environment. But the second thing important to know, even if we might not necessarily be able to solve it immediately, is to be aware of the effects that these pollutants play, including how they might synergistically interact with other stressors on these animals. So, it's often not one of the threats like fishing or shipping or tourism or pollution that will kill off a population. But when you put these things together, the effects might start to be significant. So, for example, with PCBs, they on their own, they might not necessarily kill off a population. But if something were to happen, some catastrophic event, which leads to some mass mortality, I don't know, like an oil spill or something like that, then the PCBs can actually prevent recovery because they suppress reproduction and because of the effects they have on reproduction. So it is, like you said, it's quite a complex topic and there's no easy fixes, but being aware of these things and, and keeping them in mind in various conservation strategies is important. And then we also can use them to learn from past mistakes, because even though we banned PCBs and DDTs, there are now new so-called emerging contaminants that are introduced to the world, which are used. And then for almost every new compound, a couple of years later, we find out that they have some negative effects on the environment. So sometimes it's maybe better to learn the lessons from the past and maybe prevent making the same mistakes in the future. Yeah, it's a complex topic, but this is kind of, I guess, in a nutshell.
Yes, I think it was a very good summary, because it's one of those things I asked you to explain probably years and years of work in one answer, so it's an impossible thing to kind of tackle. But it summed it up very nicely, and kind of hopefully people listening will kind of take away and think, oh, okay, if there's something that's looking slightly concerning or something that kind of I shouldn't really be doing, but it's okay because it'll only have a little effect. All these little effects add up, and all of the things go on. And it was thinking about the oil spill scenario, or a kind of major event scenario, where we like to think the chances of those are minimal, but if there are all these other things that are slowing the reproductive rate, are slowing the kind of, if you've got a suppressed, I think the last year we're all very aware of what happens if people have a suppressed immune system. It can have serious effects and serious things. So it's something that transfers between, it doesn't just affect us, it affects all these other things, or all these other animals that kind of you might not necessarily think of immediately, but are very important to think about. So yeah, that's really interesting, and I think sadly though there are, well, no, not sadly, incredibly though, there are other bits of research that you do that are very, very interesting. So I think move on to the next one that I wanted to ask you about, which was, we've kind of talked a little bit about already, being that dolphins acting in kind of strange or unusual or different ways in the case of the plastic bag. So something you kind of study or have been working on is kind of the interactions between dolphins and humans, and how different groups kind of act in different ways. And I wondered, to help the listeners kind of visualize that, is that what are the kind of range of different behaviors that you see dolphins doing, and what are the different interactions that take place?
So the population of dolphins we study here in the North Adriatic, the primary method of studying them is so-called photo identification, in which we take photographs of dolphin dorsal fins, and then we use their natural markings on these dorsal fins to recognize them and to tell individuals apart. So from that we know a number of things, including how large the population size and how that changes through time. But we can also look at their social structure. And interestingly, we found out that our population is kind of structured into different social groups, which means that, dolphins, just like humans, can be cliquey. So they might prefer certain other dolphins to hang around with, and might avoid certain other individuals. And we actually see this here, where we have quite a strong social structuring of the population. And interestingly, these dolphins differ. The two main groups, social groups that we know, they differ in how they interact with fishing activities in the area. Here, as in many other places of the world, the so-called trawlers are quite common. Trawlers are fishing boats which actually drag nets behind them, usually on the seafloor, but sometimes also up in the water column. And dolphins have learned to take advantage of that and to swim behind these trawlers and feed either on the fish kind of stirred up and brought up by the net behind the net, or in some cases even going into the net itself to take advantage of the fish, which is concentrated there and not being able to escape. And we saw an amazing difference between these two groups, where one group will pretty much follow trawlers on a regular basis, not always, but quite regularly, and the other will not, for some reason, which we still don't know what it is. And it's an interesting pattern which has already been demonstrated in some other areas of the world as well. But what's even more interesting here is that these dolphins also differ in how they use their area, in the sense that they overlap in space, but they don't overlap in time. So one group will use a given area only in certain parts of the day, and then the other group will use it in other parts of the day, and these two groups hardly ever meet. Why that's the case, we still don't know. Maybe they just don't like each other. Maybe they have some sort of different feeding strategies. But interestingly, the behavior related to the fisheries doesn't explain this temporal patterning, because for a number of reasons, because trawlers operate day round here. They also do not operate in certain areas where both dolphin groups come. The trawler dolphins don't necessarily always follow the trawlers, even if they're around. Anyway, so it's quite interesting patterning and interesting differences in how these dolphins behave. And it's not unusual to see different social groups in different parts of the world, splitting their habitat, where with one group using a certain part of the range and the other group using a different area. That has been demonstrated in a number of places worldwide. But what hasn't been demonstrated is this strange time patterning, where dolphins actually share the area based on time of day. And as we were kind of discovering this and documenting it and trying to find examples of this in the literature, we found out that this type of temporal partitioning doesn't seem to have been described in any mammals anywhere in the world. So it's really peculiar. We're still kind of now continuing, pursuing different lines of further research to try to see what might be driving this. But it's also interesting to consider in the conservation framework, because it shows that not all segments of the same population necessarily interact with human activities in the same way, which means they might also respond differently to certain human stressors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's really, it's the temporal kind of shifting and moving of groups is really an odd thing, because you'd think that will have very affect kind of diet and all sorts of behaviors in ways that go beyond simply, oh, they're in this space, because it's what else is going on in that space in those times. It's a really interesting kind of um, thing that, yeah, again, too many questions. It brings up more questions than it probably answers.
That's exactly the case. Yeah.
uh,
When we found out one thing, three new questions cropped up.
mhm,
And we also looked at, for example, pollutants, which we talked about earlier, and found out no differences there. So they're all equally loaded with PCBs. But interestingly, that you mentioned diet, we are now actually looking into diet through so-called stable isotopes, where we can get from tissue samples of the dolphins, we can actually tell what they're feeding on, and to see the differences in feeding. And even though we're still in a preliminary phase of looking at that, there do seem to be some differences in what trophic level or how high up the food chain these animals are feeding, and there do seem to be some differences there, which is interesting. And then we're also looking into genetics to see if genetics help explain any of this. If the animals within a certain social groups are more related to each other than with other groups. And so this is again something we're actively looking at now.
and yeah, there's the lines of inquiry that come up are, yeah, really interesting. And I think, I don't know, it's, yeah, the diet thing is the one that's really sticky, and because I don't know whether I'm just hungry or whatever it is, but I'm really stuck on the diet. Like, interesting. So yeah, but fascinating. And I guess, well, something that immediately, again, it comes back to them feeding, but talking about them kind of, and the interactions then with people and following the boats. Do you find then that the group that is following these boats, is there a higher rate of them being caught in these types of activities and being, or is there an equal chance that one of the group that is trying to stay away gets caught? Like, is there a difference there that you've acknowledged yet, or?
Not that we can tell. So we observed a large number of these interactions, and there's nothing to suggest that these dolphins either get caught in these nets, at least not here or not very regularly. And there doesn't seem to be any injuries associated to that, or any retaliation by the fishermen, luckily. So not that we can tell. In theory, yeah, you can imagine that they might be more at risk from getting bycaught, and maybe overall the risk might be there. On the other hand, they seem to be quite well used to navigating around these nets, so that maybe they're actually, if they do encounter nets, who knows, maybe they're actually less likely to get caught because they're so experienced. It's really hard to tell. And then on the other hand, there might be risks because of these injuries, or risk of death. But on the other hand, there clearly are benefits because of the energy of the food intake, because it's maybe easier for them to find sufficient food this way, reduce the amount of energy they need to expend to get that food. So at the moment, these are all kind of questions we have, but we don't know if there's any long-term, benefit to either group in terms of that.
Interesting. Kind of shifting the conversation slightly, I guess, but also it kind of has to do with dividing them into these groups and the different social interactions. Is that another bit of research that I kind of wanted to ask about was the way that you identify dolphins and the way that you kind of split them up, because the usual way that I had heard of was the one that you mentioned, kind of using the dorsal, the fin to kind of identify markings and things as it comes out the water. You can get photos and all sorts of things. But something that you sent me to kind of look over, you identify them using faces as well, which makes perfect sense. If you're identifying something, look at its face. But not something I'd heard of previously, and I wanted to kind of ask, what made you want to use that method, or why did you start kind of looking into that method as an alternative, or as an additional element to identifying the dolphins?
Yeah, so this is, I think, one of those, in my view, cool examples where you kind of stumble across something, I think, by accident, and not necessarily by, thinking about it ahead. So yeah, dorsal fin ID is widespread worldwide and has been, in existence for more than 40 years now. And it's a well kind of proven method and reliable because of two main factors. The dorsal fin is the part of the animal that shows up every time the animal comes up to surface. So it's a good part of the body to use. And then it also has a lot of distinguishing features which are individually distinct because these animals interact with each other, they bite each other during play or during fighting, and then you get these nicks and notches on the dorsal fin, which makes them sufficiently distinct that you can then tell animals apart. So part of the body that is easily visible at most surfacings, and it carries sufficient information for you to identify them. So when it comes to these faces, this was really me when I was doing my undergrad thesis and going through tons and tons of photographs, identifying them. Just by chance, sometimes we would get photographs of dolphin faces in them. And I kind of caught myself a few times looking at the face and thinking, oh, I think I know who this is. And this was a part of the photo where the head was already visible above the water surface, but the fin was still hidden underneath. So I would flick forward to the next photo, and very often, sure enough, it would be the dolphin that I thought, that I thought it was. So at the beginning, this was just kind of a fun observation, just a, haha, cool moment. But then as I started chatting about it to my friends and casually mentioning it in some of my talks, a bunch of colleague scientists asked me, have you guys published this? I mean, this is interesting. So I said, no, we haven't. It's just kind of just an interesting observation. But then we actually decided to look at it more formally and more rigorously. So we actually designed a study where we, collected all the photographs of faces that we had. We cross-referenced them to the dorsal fin so that we could know who these faces belong to. And then we had naive participants who don't know these animals to try to match the faces. And the results were incredibly compelling, showing that people can actually match dolphin faces, that these features on the faces were long-term, so you could use them over a longer period of time, and they were also symmetric on both sides of the face. So you can match the animal from the left side to the right side of the face. And of course, this will not replace dorsal fin ID, but it can complement it in a number of ways because, marks on the fins can change sometimes quite fast, especially in socially very active animals. And then with facial features, they tend to be less prone to short time changes. So in theory, they might help you reduce any long-term errors in identification. But especially for calves, which tend to have clean dorsal fins with no markings, we often cannot tell calves apart if they are not with their mother. And after they leave their mother, if they haven't acquired sufficient marking by that time, then we lose them from our radar, so to say, and we will not be able to identify them next time we meet them without their mother. With faces, however, this can actually help us, follow these animals after they get weaned. So this can help us with cross-generational studies and having this link of who the mother was, maybe who the grandmother was, and so on. So even sort of building family trees and so on. So anyway, just this additional method can help us with certain aspects of studying these animals, and it can improve our understanding of their biology and ecology. Of course, it will depend between species. Some species might not lift their heads out of the water very often, so you can't necessarily use that. There are certain studies worldwide where they actually use underwater photography, so that might be more useful in that context. And then I also noticed from my personal observations in different parts of the world that even within the same species of bottlenose dolphins, you might have differences among populations in how likely they are to put their heads out of the water. So it might be more amenable in some populations and less in others. So this is a method that hasn't been, like you said, it hasn't been described before. It hasn't been found in the literature. And a couple of years ago, we actually actually publish this in peer-reviewed literature. So to actually publish this finding that you can tell dolphins apart by faces, and why it might be useful for certain research questions. And there was actually a recent master students from Bangor University who tried to replicate this study on animals from Cardigan Bay, and successfully also were able to kind of reliably distinguish them. So there might be something more to this than just our weird dolphins.
Yes, and it must be nice it goes from being an interest, because I remember the one bit of when I was doing statistics, and the person who was teaching me statistics, it was always humans are very good at spotting and making up patterns in their head. It might be complete. It's just you thinking, oh, there's this or there's that, and so to have to be able to justify in your head, no, there is actually, we can use these faces. It's not just a coincidence that I happened to know because I've looked through all of these pictures 100 times that what these animals are. It must be very rewarding to kind of be able to do that. And yes, your answer,
Exactly.
I was going to ask what the benefits, what the challenges, has anyone tried to reproduce it? But you managed to kind of include that all in your first answer. So that's really interesting. I don't even need to be here, which is. um, so
Actually,
that's.
one of the reasons we had these naive participants was because we wanted to, because we might be biased because we know these animals so well. So we wanted to have a completely independent set of eyes to look at this and, see if they can match them without having any prior knowledge of these animals. And this is why it was actually so compelling, because we also divided it into people who were experienced in photo ID of dolphins general with dorsal fins, but then we also had people who were not familiar with dolphins at all to look at this, and again the results were compelling. So yeah.
It's really interesting, and I think it's, as you say, a good. It might be more complicated to kind of get the underwater photography right and things, but it is a good bonus to have something else to kind of compare, especially if there are these things. They might have a massive scar, or a scar would probably last a while, but if they have a notch that slowly over time starts to change or kind of expand or whatever it is, it's good to have these kind of backups and interesting extra things. I guess we're getting towards the end of the interview now, but I just had a couple kind of last questions for you, and I guess um, we've talked a lot about your research and what you're doing now, and kind of what kind of questions you're answering, these things coming up. But what is the kind of next? What are you looking into now? Are these still the three kind of main things, or what are you looking forward to kind of studying next?
So we're still kind of continuing in these directions that we've been looking at, to kind of try to further fine tune some of the research questions, and to also underwater acoustics and underwater noise. So we recently had a year-long project looking at the presence of underwater sound in our study area, and how that relates to the animals using the area. And one thing that is also our current topic of our research is to see if these different social groups, if they vocalize differently, if there's anything in their vocalization that makes them distinguishable from one another. So it's kind of a part of the same story, trying to see what some of the drivers of this partitioning and acoustics plays some role in that. We're also looking at whether we can build up a catalog of so-called signature whistles. Different dolphins have what we call signature whistles. This has been shown by other researchers years ago, that each individual animal actually has a unique pattern of a whistle that conveys its identity to other dolphins. So other dolphins know who is calling, and they're even able to copy these sounds to actually address a specific dolphin. So if you're able to build up a catalog of those sounds, you're able to actually get identities of these animals by sound, not necessarily just by visual and by photographs. And if you go one step further, ideally, with time, we might even be able to cross-reference whistles to dorsal fins to actually know in the long run, if we detect somebody at nighttime when we can't be out in the field, from these static loggers we put out in the sea, we might be able to tell, in theory at least, who was there when we were not even there to photograph them. So this is kind of some of the research we've been also looking at now. We've been looking at some of the utilization of drones, so unmanned aerial vehicles, which are kind of emerging technology and are being used more and more worldwide for different science and conservation related questions. And in case of dolphins, a very interesting thing to notice that drones gave us a completely different perspective of what the animals are doing underwater. And we noticed that from the boat, you get a very different feeling of what's actually happening under the surface than if you have a drone above them. And also in relation to conservation, we can look at things like body condition from these drones, and that can, help you make comparisons between different animals, between maybe somewhat compromised animals to more healthy animals. You can look at differences among populations. You can look at different periods or different seasons. So this also offers a number of interesting research avenues which we are now kind of looking into.
Opening even more questions for yourself, but
exactly, yes.
Bring some along the way. Well, that kind of sums up everything nicely. And I guess the last thing would be, if anybody is interested in kind of keeping up with that research, where should they go and what should they look at if they're kind of interested and want to learn more, and where should they go to find out more?
So if they want to learn more about our research, they can go to www.morigenos.org to learn more about our work. And we also have a number of social media profiles such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But more general, and people can also join us in the summer. We organize 10-day research courses where everybody can join the research team for a period of 10 days and basically experience what it's like to be a part of a team of a dolphin and a dolphin researcher. For some people, this might be a good opportunity to kind of get a feel for how this works, and then they might want to pursue a career or their studies in this direction. For other people, it just might be a different way of spending a holiday more actively and supporting our work in research and conservation. But more generally speaking, how people can get involved into these kinds of things in different parts of the world. There's a number of organizations in all over the world doing this or similar type of research, and people can get involved in a number of ways, including following these organizations on social media, volunteering, taking part in any courses that they might be organizing, helping with beach cleanups, but more than anything, just trying to incorporate kind of responsible choices and behaviors into your everyday life, including reducing the amount of disposable plastic you're using, supporting, sustainable development projects rather than just short-term, economic gains. A number of things where we can actually make an impact to the better just by everyday choices. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, I guess, without going into too much detail. Sorry, just to add, for people who are looking into marine mammal science more specifically, there is a Society for Marine Mammalogy, which is a global society kind of bringing together scientists and enthusiasts on marine mammals all over the world. The society also organizes biannual conferences. In Europe, there is European Cetacean Society, which also organizes annual conferences. So, interested people can go and check their websites and can learn much more about marine mammals and different species and projects and so from their websites.
Perfect. That sums it all up really nicely, and I'll put links to everything in the description for the episode so that just make it easier for people. They don't have to write notes and everything. They can go down and just click right on all the buttons for things. So yes, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you
For the invitation. It was a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much. And we are back. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview. It was an absolute pleasure, and I cannot thank Tilen enough for his time talking about St Andrews and then the dolphins, and not just the kind of current case study, but things that he's looked on in the past. All such interesting stories and perspectives that I really hope you guys gained something, gained a bit of knowledge that you didn't know before, gained a bit of perspective that you didn't have, and yeah, just generally enjoyed and felt inspired by what was said. Of course, if there is anything you want to learn more about, I'll put links to everything we discussed throughout the show in the description for this episode, so make sure to go down there, check them out, have a look, see what you can do if there's little things you want to change, if there's little tips or tricks or things that you think you can adapt into your own lives, or if you want to do more and kind of donate, or you want to contribute more than that. Really just kind of, yeah, go and have a look, see what you can do. That kind of brings us to the end of today's show. Please feel free to act on anything we've said this week to help our oceans with the kind of donations or combating pollution, or of course anything we said last week on World Oceans Day to do with that Catherine talked about with kind of getting involved in citizen science. They're all really important concepts and all help to kind of protect the whole ocean ecosystem. So do what you can. If you have the time and you have the resources and you have all these things, please make an effort to do what you can to help our seas. Of course, you can follow the podcast on your social media platforms of choice. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and LinkedIn as well, if you're on there. And make sure to follow us on your podcast streaming service of choice. Instagram, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. I think I said Instagram. That's not right. Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're on Anchor and Breaker and all of the other ones. So make sure to follow us on there as well. Yeah. So thank you so much for listening, and until next time. Yes. Thank you all again. So much for listening.